Hey, AP Statistics. So today we're going to look at what can go wrong when we are sampling, doing sample surveys, where we get our sample, we get information from them. And survey, I didn't mention this yet, but survey can have the meaning of like you hand somebody a survey. We could be doing that, but when we say sample surveys in this sense, we mean just this process of gathering data. It might not actually be through a survey. You might just be recording data. So we have the other definition of survey where the person fills out a response or you ask them questions. That's got its own things that we'll actually get to in this section. So as we learned, we've had bad sampling methods like convenience and voluntary response that those can lead to bias because we aren't representing the population properly. So we can avoid those by using random sampling or other random sampling methods. But other problems in conducting sample surveys are more difficult to avoid. And so one of our biggest issues is undercoverage. So this occurs when some members of a population are less likely to be chosen or cannot be chosen in a sample. So when we do our sampling, because of some way, if we're selecting it, if individuals get left out for one reason, they're going to be undercovered. And so that's, Stratified tries to, account for this. We want to make sure we get representative of all these different groups. But undercoverage can result when, if we were like sampling the school or something like that, like I might be less likely to get students who are absent. And so we would be undercovering that population of students that's absent. And maybe that population of students that's absent would feel a particular way and that might end up causing bias and might end up leading our statistic to be higher or lower. And so that's one thing. If your list of your population is incomplete or other individuals aren't available or they're just less likely to be selected, that leads to undercoverage. Another thing that's very closely related and kind of can lead to the same thing is non-response. Non-response is when the individual has been chosen for the sample and can't be contacted or refuses to participate. So, if you try and call somebody, like we selected you to be in our sample, but they actively choose not to be involved. They choose not to, or they don't pick up the phone or something like that. That non-response kind of actually leads to undercoverage. That type of individual gets left out of our study, and that can cause bias because maybe those individuals that we can't contact or that they refuse to participate in our study, maybe there's something about them that we're missing when we end up creating our sample. So ideally, in a statistical ideal world, everybody we choose for our sample would have to participate. In reality, in this country at least, you have the right not to participate in that research, in that study. So that is, from a statistical standpoint, that is undesirable because, we want to know what those individuals think. Those people who are too busy or not interested or whatever, like we want to know what they think because they represents a group of the population that ultimately then gets undercovered. And then another one you can look at is response bias. So this can occur whenever there's basically if people respond and their answers aren't accurate to a survey question. And there's a number of things that can lead to this. Response bias, maybe people feel uncomfortable about, what you're asking, and so they don't quite tell the truth. It can be, that can be related to who's asking the questions. If a certain person, a certain gender is asking a question, if somebody comes up and surveys you, you might react differently if it's one gender or the other, or if it's a uniformed officer versus somebody casual, So there's a lot of things that affect people's response, and if there's some sort of systematic pattern. So it's again, this is not people being biased. This is not like when you're asking me and I'm biased against this or towards that. This is if our method, if our system has bias built in. And maybe it's in the wording of the questions. If you ask questions in a particular way, you ask leading questions and things like that, that can lead to a response bias. So anything that leads to that, where people basically aren't, and they may not be lying, to say that they're lying, they could be lying. And honestly, that happens a lot. If you ask especially high school students on, surveys, they'll make up silly answers and stuff, because sometimes people will be lying and just being silly, not taking it seriously, or they'll tell you what they think you want to hear and so on. Sometimes it's not even that they're lying; they just they're just influenced, on like a subconscious level to respond more in a particular way, and we see that with like wording of the question and things like that. Sometimes students misuse the term voluntary response to explain why certain individuals don't respond to a sample survey. Their belief is that participation in the survey is optional, voluntary, so anyone can refuse to take part. What the students are describing is non-response. So if we contact an individual and they choose not to respond, that's non-response. Voluntary response is if we're not specifically contacting you, not selecting you, we're just kind of putting it out there, putting it on our website, or putting up a sign or billboard that says, hey, if you want to participate, come forward. So that's make sure you get that key difference between voluntary response and non-response. So that wraps up section 4.1. A lot of vocabulary this unit, not a lot of math going on. Like I said, a lot of vocabulary. Spend some time with those. Make sure that you can make sense of those concepts and understand how those would be applied for this section.